In the second half of this podcast and interview, I'll be talking to Fiona Murray and David Willets about what we've been talking about and what we've been listening to in the first half of this session on the importance of thinking about scientific research, the importance of venture science. And I imagine, David Willets, nobody really contests the importance of fundamental science, venture research.
You're absolutely right, Hal. I think that we all agree the importance of blue skies thinking. Of course, there's also completely legitimate incremental work, but the excitement comes from the big new ideas. I think the debate has been about the extent to which it's feasible for those to be supported in Britain at the moment. And actually, although we can always do better, I personally think with a network of different funding agencies, public, private, charitable, with a lot of young researchers coming to Britain from abroad because of the freedom they have, I personally think we do quite well on giving people the opportunity of doing blue skies research, but it's always good to be tested and challenged as to whether there's more we should do.
Well, your position came under a lot of criticism earlier on from some very distinguished scientists, and especially with regard to peer review. Any thoughts and modification in your own position about the importance of peer review?
Well, I was a bit surprised about it because, of course, peer review is not some government plot to do down innovative science. Peer review, as someone said correctly, begins with the foundation of the Royal Society and the proceedings of the Royal Society, because there was before that, science was secret and was kind of private. It was a requirement that findings be published and open to challenge that led the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. So I think there was a kind of, that I understand there's always going to be exasperation about tiresome bureaucratic requirements, and we should always be fighting to cut them back. But getting rid of peer review, I think, would expose science to more risk of political interference. I think peer review protects science. I don't think it's a threat to science.
Well, Fiona, how about the view from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology? And do these criticisms about the bureaucratization, the form filling, so many distinguished scientists having to fill out these boxes all the time, surely this speaks to you?
It does. So I think that, David is right that I don't think the argument is about whether or not we should use peer review both to select projects and then ultimately to select what gets published. I think the question is, what are the mechanisms that we're going to use to fund different sorts of science? And we need a whole spectrum of funding approaches. I think one of the things that we see in the UK and that we also see in the United States is we have a more standard mechanism to get research funding from governments, and whether that be the various government departments in America or the research councils in the United Kingdom. But we also probably want to think about funding mechanisms that might allow us to actually identify highly talented individuals and give them the space and the freedom that they need to do something a little more risky, maybe a little more long-term, and potentially more creative. And I think we see in things like the Royal Society funding, or in the United States, something like the Howard Hughes funding mechanism, that you have an alternative that allows you to potentially fund different sorts of people or fund them in different ways. And I actually think it's the different way of funding that's probably important here. So rather than funding on a year-on-year basis and funding for a very specifically defined project, we want to give some people the opportunity that we're picking an individual and we're saying you have funding flexibility for a 5-year period. And there's quite a lot of economic evidence that suggests that when we do fund people like that, those people both come up with more impactful ideas, and they actually also come up with more disastrous ideas. So you actually see what that funding mechanism does is it sort of pushes people out along the distribution of idea quality, and it gives them the room to do something rather disastrous because they don't have to apply for the next funding round, and it also gives them the opportunity to do something a little different.
Because with the creativity goes often extreme waywardness and an absorption in oneself and one's thoughts and minds.
And extreme failure. I mean, I think we learn that in the investment community. I mean, nobody expects every single investment in venture capital, not venture research, to actually be successful.
So your point really is about investment, it's investment's point of view, but it's also an educator's point of view, finding the right kind of person.
Yes, and I think that's where the arguments sort of come together, is what's the mechanism to do that? And is the peer review process the right way of choosing particular and exceptional individuals? Is it finding somebody who happens to have really good scientific taste? I mean, how do we really go about doing that? And how do we do that in a way that allows us to identify extraordinary people who don't always have the very well-established track record, who are younger, who are not the usual suspects. So how do we find people from unusual places with unusual backgrounds?
I like the idea that a person with good scientific taste, just good judgment, good intellectual judgment. There must surely be many other ways of finding out where these people are, quite apart from the peer review mechanism, David.
Well, one of the reasons why we fund the Royal Society programme, for example, is for them absolutely to identify these talented individuals. One of the reasons why we fund great new institutions like the Crick Institute here in London is absolutely that Paul Nurse is going to run that on the basis that people will have 7 years, or perhaps 14 years, when they will be free to do curiosity-driven research. And then, of course, we're very fortunate in Britain. We have these large independent charitable foundations like the Wellcome Trust, like the Leverhulme, that will also fund these projects. So when I go around the labs in Britain, one of the things I notice actually is there are a lot of young researchers who have come here from other countries, because this is one of the places where it's a bit easier actually for a young researcher to get a grant, to lead their own research, and to do it over several years, not be expected to have a return straight away. But of course, we can always do better. But people are not sitting in government trying to suppress this type of activity.
There is something very, you were talking about German universities earlier, and there is something very hierarchical, wonderful as well, about the German university system. You know, Max Planck himself emerged from a wonderful family tradition. You know, his great-grandparents, professors of theology, and then of law, and then of history in Göttingen, and then sort of Planck lit the flame, kept it going in a scientific way in the late 19th and early 20th century. But the cult of the Herr Professor, the apex, the triangle, it's a very hierarchical thing.
Yes.
And it carries on, I think, in that university.
I think you're
tradition.
absolutely right, Hal, and in other continental universities as well. And one of the things that I remember when I was Minister for Science asking to see was the age distribution of the principal investigators receiving Research Council grants. Because one of the things that I worried about with peer review is that 50-something scientists would instinctively like work done by other 50-something scientists who had gone through the same kind of intellectual development as they had, and would they suppress or not support bids from 30-something scientists. But, and the truth is there is more funding going to the principal investigators in their 50s, but there is still a very healthy showing of people in their 20s and 30s. And I think some of the issues we're debating are really not actually particularly about government. They're about whether getting to the frontier of your scientific discipline now takes longer, and that in turn means that scientific researchers tend to embark on their independent research a bit older than perhaps 20 years ago. So I think there are some real challenges for the scientific community, and there's perhaps a little bit of displacement activity that somehow they're being laid at the door of government. When science in Britain is highly autonomous, we really do not try in government to tell scientists what to do, because that would absolutely take the spark of genius and extinguish it.
Thinking of spark of genius, when I think about some aspects of modern science and where we can really find these people of genius, Fiona, I wonder whether it's an increased attention to the multidisciplinary is going to be very important in the future. Something that responds very much, as you know, to what we do here at Legatum as an institute, and as the work of Legatum MIT as well. And your professional career is very involved with this multidisciplinary work, isn't it?
It is, and I myself am a quite multidisciplinary person, because I have training in chemistry and engineering, and I now do a lot of work on public policy and economics. I think one of the things that's quite challenging is, although we actually have found these mechanisms where we can fund particular individuals and we can give them the freedom and to have the creativity, given that a lot of the research is actually done in multidisciplinary teams, then the question is, how can we balance those two things? So do we want to provide alternative funding mechanisms where we can actually fund a collection of creative people? And I think what we see in some of the American universities is, because the university themselves actually provides the early stage startup and security for young faculty members, that they select the faculty members. It's not quite peer review, but it's actually a form of peer review. I mean, a group of faculty are sitting there deciding who they want to bring into their community. They give each of them funding that will last them several years, but also then put them in environments where they actually want them explicitly to work and interact with their peers and colleagues in other departments. And we did some work recently at MIT where we were looking at the distribution of patents and publications across different buildings. So we were trying to work out which specific buildings were the most productive and the most creative. And what we found is there's a small number of buildings that are really very unattractive, so it has nothing to do with their architectural prowess, that basically are sort of corridors. I mean, they sit at the intersection of, you wouldn't know that if you walked through them that you were moving from the Department of Chemistry to Physics to Electrical Engineering. And it's because they're those crossroads where people talk to each other, and that it's something about that. So if we can find ways to fund individuals but encourage them to interact, then I think we get some of this multidisciplinary
Well, now you've given me
engagement.
the idea for the next seminar that we do on the roads to freedom, discussing the nature of creativity in the scientific world and the world of the humanities as well. But thank you, David Willett and Fiona Murray, very much indeed for being with us this afternoon.